Warning, incoming goblin. Warning, incoming game. You get it, it's a reboot reference.
This video is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc. with free weekly content and free shipping on orders over $150. You can save 5% site-wide by using the promo code MTGMudsta. If you're looking for a direct way to help the channel, please consider joining my Patreon and becoming a member of the generic Goblin Gang. Hey gang, and welcome back. Today finds the 3Ms back in my basement, and I've got a brand new deck as well. In today's game I'm playing my Vishgraz deck, keeping Undergrowth Stadium, Cankerbloom, Swamp, Mere Convert, Anoint with Affliction, Pheresis Outbreak, and Temple Garden. Maximus has gotta go fast playing his mono-red Slicer deck, keeping a Mountain, Myriad Landscape, Basilisk Collar, Soul Ring, Inspiring Statuary, Shiny Impetus, and a Mana Geyser. Mika has borrowed Maximus's Yuriko deck and keeps a Fairy Seer, Horned Locked Whale, Shadow of Mortality, Snow-Covered Island, Throat Slitter, Snow-Covered Swamp, and a Shipwreck Marsh. Mackenzie is playing Syr Ginger, keeping Library of Leng, Silent Arbiter, Inquisitor's Flail, Urza's Tower, Haunted Fengraf, Meteor Golem, and Mishra's Factory. I win the die roll and start us off. I play a tapped Temple Garden. Maximus draws, playing a Mountain into a Soul Ring. He taps the Soul Ring for Mask of Memory and passes. Mika plays a Snow-Covered Island and casts Fairy Seer, scrying 2 and passing. Mackenzie draws and plays a Haunted Fengraf. He taps that for Library of Leng and passes. I've got an Undergrowth Stadium and pay 2 for a Mere Convert. Maximus draws and plays a tap Myriad Landscape. He then casts Slicer for more than meets the eye, coming in on the other side, and he swings him at Mackenzie for 3, who takes the hit. This transforms Slicer, and Max then passes. Mika gets Slicer and then draws her turn. He plays a Snow-Covered Swamp and goes to combat. He swings Slicer at Mackenzie, who isn't able to block. And before damage, Mika instead ninjutsus in Yuriko, and Slicer returns to Max's hand. And Yuriko's trigger then reveals a Sword Coast Serpent, and all of Mika's opponents lose 7. After that, he passes. Mackenzie plays a Mishra's Factory, and wants to also be in the turn 2 Commander Club with Syr Ginger, and passes to me after that. I draw and play a Swamp. I cast Infectious Inquiry, drawing 2, losing 2, and giving each opponent a poison counter. I pass after that. Max replays Slicer as it's more than meets the eye side, and he equips it with the Mask of Memory, and then goes to combat. He swings Slicer at Mackenzie, who doesn't block, and Max gets to draw 2 cards, and discard 1. He then transforms Slicer, and passes turn. Mika gets Slicer again, and draws her turn. He then plays a Shipwreck Marsh, and moves to combat. He swings Yuriko at Max, the Fairy Seer at me, and Slicer at Mackenzie. Mackenzie declares no blocks, and before damage, Mika ninjutsus in a Throat Slitter, bouncing Slicer back to Max's hand again, and we all then take the hits. The Throat Slicer then destroys Syr Ginger, and the Yuriko trigger reveals a Choked Estuary, and then a Slither Blade, so we all take 1. With nothing else, Mika passes. Mackenzie draws and plays an Urza's Tower. He then casts an Inquisitor's Flail and passes. I draw and play a Plains. I then play an Arcane Signet, and then a Cankerbloom and pass to Max. Max plays a Mountain for turn, and taps enough to cast a Mana Geyser, making 10 red mana, and uses it to recast Slicer again, and then equip him. And then casts a Basilisk Collar and equips that to him as well. He finishes off his floating mana with an Expedition map, and moves to combat. He swings Slicer at Mika for 6 total, and since he connects, Max gets to draw 2 and discard 1 twice, as well as gain 6 from the Basilisk Collar. After that, Max passes. On Mika's upkeep, Maximus gives him Slicer, and Mika then draws her turn. he casts Sensei's Divining Top and goes to combat. He swings the Throat Slitter and Yuriko at Max, and Slicer goes at me. I block Slicer with the Canker Bloom, and before damage, sacrifice it and target the Sensei's Divining Top to destroy it. Mika responds to this by activating the top to draw a card, and the ninjas then connect. This has Yuriko revealing the top and Trailblazer's boots, so we then take 3 total. After that, Mika casts Slitherblade and passes. For once, Mackenzie gets Slicer and then draws her turn. He plays a Blasted Landscape, and then a Silent Arbiter, and he moves to combat. He swings Slicer at Mika, who chumps with a Slitherblade and passes after that. I get Slicer this time around as well, and I draw and play a Brushland. I then cast Demonic Tutor and go and find a card to hand, and then move to combat. I swing Slicer at Mika, who chumps with a Fairy Seer token, and once that's done, I cast Toxic Deluge to wipe the board except for the Silent Arbiter. With nothing else, I pass. Max has its Servox Tome come in, and he gains the initiative, grabbing a mountain to hand, and then playing it. He then plays out Jeska's Will, getting 7 red mana, and uses it to recast Slicer as the transform side, and then enchants it with a Shiny Impetus. Going to combat, Max swings Slicer at Mika for 5 and gets a treasure token from the Impetus. Mika takes the hit, and Slicer transforms. In his second main phase, Max then sacrifices the treasure to equip Slicer with the Mask of Memory and passes. Mika gets Slicer and then draws her turn, and goes to combat, swinging Slicer at me. I declare no blocks, and Mika decides not to ninjutsu in, so I take 10, and Max's Mask of Memory triggers twice. After combat, he plays a Selendi Isle. Mika then casts an Arcane Signet, and then a Mistcloaked Herald, and passes to Mackenzie. Mackenzie gets Slicer and draws. He plays a Joyrous Familiar and moves to combat. He swings Slicer at Mika, and Mika responds by casting Lagoon Breach off the Horned Lock Whale. Max responds, however, by casting a Red Elemental Blast to counter it, and Mika is then forced to jump with the Mistcloaked Herald. With nothing else, Mackenzie passes. I get Slicer and draw. I play an Eldrazi Displacer and go to combat. I swing Slicer at Mackenzie, who chumps with Joyrous Familiar, and I pass after that. Max regains Slicer and ventures further into the Undercity, putting 2+1/+1 counters onto his commander. He then draws and plays Staff of Titania. Once that's out, he cracks the Expedition map and goes to find Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, which he is allowed to play. He then places his land for turn and equips the Staff to Splicer. Going to combat, he swings the Lethal Slicer at Mika and makes a Forest Dryad token, but I intervene by activating an Eldrazi Displacer to flicker Slicer and have it come back immediately. Max then moves to a second main phase, re-equipping Slicer with the Staff of Titania and Mask of Memory, and then passes. Mika gets Slicer on his upkeep and draws. He swings Slicer at Mackenzie, who blocks with the Silent Arbiter. He plays a Black Bloom Rogue and then a Sensei's Divining Top, and passes. Mackenzie draws and plays Krark-Clan Ironworks. He sacrifices his Library of Leng to equip the Inquisitor's Flail to Slicer, and then moves to combat. He swings it at me, and Mika returns the favor I did for him by casting Capsize Wave off Sword Coast Serpent, and bounces Slicer to Max's hand. After that, Mackenzie passes. I draw and play a Night's Whisper. I draw 2 and lose 2, and then play a Swamp. I cast a Grateful Apparition and pass to Max. Max deals 5 to Mika with the Undercity trigger, and then draws for turn. He then plays Slicer again from his hand, and casts Tenza Goda's Maul, and equips it to his commander. He plays Urza's Saga as his land for turn, and then re-equips the Staff of Titania to Slicer as well. Going to combat, he swings Slicer at Mika, and makes a Forest Dryad token, and before moving to damage, I once more flicker Slicer with the Eldrazi Displacer. After that, Max moves to a second main phase and re-equips Tenza to it and passes. Mika gets Slicer and draws. He plays a snow-covered island and then activates the top, and then moves to combat. He swings the Black Bloom Rogue at Max and Slicer at Mackenzie. Max double blocks the Rogue with his 4 Dryad tokens, and Mackenzie declares no blocks, which has Mika ninjutsuing in Yuriko and bouncing Slicer back to Max's hand. Mackenzie then takes 1, and Yuriko deals damage, which gets him a trigger, and he reveals Higuri the Still Wind, and we all lose 4. He then passes after that. Mackenzie draws and sacrifices the Inquisitor's Flail to cast a coveted jewel. He draws 3 as it comes in, and then plays Temple of the False God, and then a Basalt Monolith. He finishes up with a Nettle Cyst and passes to me. I draw and go to combat, swinging my Grateful Apparition at Max for 1. He takes it, and I proliferate everyone's poison and gain the initiative, which has me going to find a forest. After combat, I play the forest, and then cast Vishgraz, which as it comes in, makes me 3 might tokens. Max draws and upticks Urza's Saga. He then replays Slicer, and plays a mountain, and then equips Slicer with the Staff of Titania and Tenza. Going to combat, Max swings Slicer at Mika, and he responds by drawing off the top, and then casting Grave Purge. Mika still has nothing at this point, and I'm too low in life to risk another hit from Yuriko, so I let him die, and Max passes after that. Mackenzie gets Slicer and draws. He plays Urza's Workshop, and then casts Duplicant, but Max counters it with Tibble's Trickery. He rolls for it, and Mackenzie then mills 3, and flips into a Lorien Brooch, aka Trailblazer's Boots. Mackenzie then recasts Syr Ginger and goes to combat. He swings Slicer at me, and the equipped Germ at Max. I flicker Slicer with the Eldrazi Displacer, while Max takes 6, and Mackenzie then passes. I put 2 counters onto Vishgraz as I move through the Undercity, and then draw for turn. I then play Phyresis Outbreak, giving everyone a poison counter, and then giving all of my opponent's creature -1/-1 based on how many poison counters they have. Going to combat, I swing everything except for the Displacer at Max. He's got no blocks and takes it, going up to 7 poison, and down to 5 life. I get to proliferate again, and bump up the poison counters, and then cast a Phyrexian Altar, and pass. Maximus draws, and puts the final counter on the Urza Saga, and floats a Colorless, and then goes to find a Commander's Plate. He then equips Tenza onto Slicer, and moves to combat. He swings Slicer at Mackenzie, who dies from regular damage. In his post-combat main phase, he then plays his own Silent Arbiter, and equips the Basilisk Collar to it, and passes. On his end step, I sacrifice 2 mites to cast Anoint with Affliction, and target the Arbiter. This has Maximus responding by casting Wild Ricochet on the Anoint to redirect it to the Eldrazi Displacer, and also gets a copy and uses it to target Vishgraz. I respond however by sacrificing enough mites to flicker and save Vishgraz and make 3 more mite tokens. Even with removal resolving, Maximus knows that he's got lethal coming at him for his next attack, and knows he can't stop it, so he scoops it up to me. Game review time. This game was 1 hour, 3 minutes, and 15 seconds. And right off the bat, it seemed like Mika came out swinging, which is often the case with the Yuriko deck. As long as you have an unblockable creature, and at least 1 ninja, chances are people are taking a lot of damage as soon as Yuriko connects. I actually enjoyed the part later on in the game where Mika and I were basically keeping Slicer in check, although unfortunately for Mika, I got too low in health to allow him to live, because 1 good Yuriko hit meant I was gone. Speaking of Slicer, he always seems to come out very early, and thank goodness Max didn't draw Jeweled Lotus. That would have been brutal to have to deal with as of turn 1, and even though we kept having answers to deal with him, he kept being an issue. Unfortunately for Mackenzie, I think he would have loved to be a bit more of an issue, but Syr Ginger just didn't get there this game. He really struggled to have enough mana to get stuff going, and even though he had a decent amount of mana rocks like that Coveted Jewel and Basalt Monolith late game, he didn't draw into any critical equipment, which meant that Syr Ginger was going to be stuck as a 3-1. I feel like I had the slowest deck at the table considering I was the only one playing green. I didn't have any ramp spells, and the best that I could do was tutor for answers. I got very lucky drawing that Eldrazi Displacer, as it allowed me to deal a Slicer at least once per combat round per around the table, and I think I was very lucky to win that game. This video wouldn't be possible without the help from my sponsors, Cool Stuff Inc., Multizone, Original Magic Art, and Alter Sleeves. But it definitely wouldn't be possible without the help from you, the viewers, and my patrons. So I just want to say thank you for watching, and to remember, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.